Hi everyone, it's Tuesday, April 28th, and today we're going to talk about the assignment 6.1, The Great Migration and Harlem Renaissance, explores 1, 2, and 5. So, concept 6.1 is titled The Great Migration and Harlem Renaissance, and the question is, how did the Great Migration affect American culture and society? So there's a quote that starts us off here, and the quote from the textbook reads, "Economic and living conditions in the South were difficult for African Americans during the late 1800s and early 1900s." And the question that follows is, identify and explain 4 factors that pushed millions of African Americans out of the South. So if you remember from earlier this year, we talked about push and pull factors. Push factors were factors from people's homelands that pushed them from their homes, that drove them from their homes. Pull factors are the attraction of other places to the people that are pushed from their homes. Okay, so we're talking push factors, things that were going on in the South that pushed African Americans out of the South. And the first thing that was going on in the South was Jim Crow. These were the segregation laws after the end of Reconstruction, which created racial segregation in public places, and you can list off many of those. I know you can. So that was one, discrimination and a lack of freedom. Closely related to that were actions of white supremacist groups like the KKK. The KKK and other like groups used intimidation and violence to keep the South the way it was, with white people on top and black people on bottom. So the first 2 push factors are related. We got Jim Crow and segregation, and white supremacy like the KKK. The third and I guess fourth push factors are more economic in nature. And the first one is the job that most African Americans had at the time, and that was sharecropping. As you will remember, sharecropping was a very, very difficult, if not impossible, job or vocation to get ahead. Sharecroppers would remain in debt. If you remember back 2 months ago, we talked about the cycle of poverty that sharecroppers found themselves in. At the end of the year, they didn't have enough money to pay off their debts, so they'd start the next year in debt, and that would just continue this cycle of poverty. So Jim Crow, KKK, sharecropping. And the fourth push factor related to sharecropping was there were farm failures all across the South, which had made it even more difficult to make ends meet. And it made African Americans more likely to leave the South, to get away from that. Okay, Explore 2 is about African Americans heading north, and the question underneath was, what was the Great Migration? Spoiler alert, the Great Migration is the name given to the movement of millions of African Americans from the South to the North to the West. Okay, the change that came with that, the change to America that came with that, is African American populations in northern industrial cities skyrocketed, because I looked into it, about 6 million black people left the South during this Great Migration. It didn't happen overnight, it happened over decades, but that is a lot of people. Okay, so the next question for Explore 2 is, how did immigration, or the lack of it, contribute to the Great Migration? So after World War I especially, there were many laws passed by the US government limiting the number of immigrants that could come into the country, okay? And for years, the industry, especially in the North, these industrial cities, needed the labor, needed the laborers, and immigrants met that need. With fewer immigrants coming into the country, that created labor shortages. So these industrial cities in the North had jobs that needed to be filled, that might have been filled by immigrants, but with fewer immigrants coming in, this was a perfect position for African Americans to step into those positions in industrial cities, like Detroit, like New York, like Chicago, okay? So that finishes Explore 2. Explore 5 is African Americans face challenges, and the question that is underneath Explore 5 is, what challenges did the new Negro face during the early 1900s? And the first question you were to answer is, for what 2 reasons were lynchings, violent acts of murder, used in the South? Well, lynchings, murder, were used to keep African Americans from standing up and to keep white people from sitting down. So it was about keeping people up the white people, keeping them in place, keeping the South the way it was, but while pushing whites up, pushing blacks down, okay? And I looked this up. Between the end of Reconstruction and the 1960s, historians believe that thousands of black people were murdered in these lynchings, thousands, okay? And at this time, the KKK, a white supremacist organization we talked about a few minutes ago, and responsible for many of these lynchings, became more popular by the 1920s. And my question to you was, what was the appeal of the KKK that attracted so many Americans? And it came down to the diversity that America was experiencing because of industrialization. With industrialization comes immigration. With the immigrants that come into the country, that makes the country more diverse, less like the white country that the South really was interested in maintaining. So you had people coming in, other than African Americans, groups like the KKK targeted a lot of these immigrant groups, like Italians and Greeks and Asians and Jewish people and Catholics, basically anyone that wasn't white and Protestant. So this appeal of the KKK was based on the increasing diversity in America and the pushback many Americans had to that diversity, okay? And then just wrapping up this kind of horrible nature of the KKK and white supremacy and racial strife, the last question in the assignment is what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921? Well, a group of African Americans, while attempting to stop the murder or the lynching of a black man, a white man was killed, okay? That led to many, many white people rioting. The rioters murdered at least 50 African Americans and burned down thousands of homes and businesses owned by African Americans. Ladies and gentlemen, that was less than 100 years ago. Okay, so that completes our discussion of the assignment 6.1, the Great Migration and Harlem Renaissance. Explore 1, 2, and 5. Tomorrow we'll pick it back up with the brain pop on the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, thank you very much, guys.